So when you go buy a wire, you have to make sure you have one big enough to carry the number of electrons that are going to flow by. And the number of electrons is what we measure in amperes. Now, if this were water that we were doing instead of electricity, you'd say, how big a diameter pipe do you need? Since it's electricity, you say, how big of a conductor do you need? You notice in my picture that the big one on top there is 12 gauge, and the little one on the bottom is 16 gauge. So something's wrong. Big should be bigger, but instead, big is littler. In other words, 12 gauge is bigger than 14 gauge, is bigger than 16 gauge. And wire sizes go that way. The lower the number, the bigger the wire. The higher the number, the smaller the wire. And you say, that's whack. Well, there's a story about why that is we won't go into, but you ought to memorize that. And guys that are doing engineering and inventing and doing science fair projects have to know what size wire you need for how much current you're going to carry. The 12 gauge wire, which is the biggest one there, is the size of wiring that's in most of our houses hooking up electric outlets and hooking up lights. 12 gauge. It just so happens that a 12 gauge wire is rated to carry 20 amps. 20 amps. A 14 gauge wire, which is a little smaller, is rated to carry 15 amps. So you can go through and figure out how big you need. I just wanted to know how big a wire do I need to hook up my lights? And I like this 14 because it's small. The 16 smaller, be easier to run, costs less. But then instead of one light, I ended up getting 5. So if I have 5 lights, I don't have 100 watts, I have 500 watts. That's a lot for a light bar in a truck.
It is.
So if I take 500 and divide 12 into it, I find out I have 40 amps of power. Now remember, a 12 gauge wire, which is the size we use in our houses, can carry 20 amps. I have 40. I'm going to have the best looking lights that nobody can turn on. And you say, well, why do you need the right size? Well, you need to have the right size because if the wire is too small, the electrons going through will make it hot. And if it gets too hot, it will go, it'll burn up. You want me to prove it? Okay, I tried taking just one of these little strands here and hooking it up to the battery. Watch this. Okay, we need to demonstrate why a wire needs to be protected. I have a piece of stranded wire, pulled the insulation off, and now I'm going to pull out one strand and separate these others out of the way. So this strand would be like having a very small wire. I'm going to hook one side of the wire up to our battery, and I'll hook the other side of the wire up to the other end of the battery. There we go. I want to get this right over the blue here so you can see it. All right, so when I turn on the battery, there's no motor or light or anything in there, so the electricity is just going to flow through as fast as it can. We call this as a short because the battery is shorted out, and that means the current's going to flow so fast, this wire is going to get hot, and since we don't have anything protected it, watch closely and see what happens. On 3. 1, 2, 3. Let's try it a little slower.
So cool.
Can you imagine what it'd be like facing the grandsons when that happens to my cat?
Be a little embarrassing, wouldn't it?
So there's definitely a problem. I need a bigger wire than even a 12 gauge. I need a huge wire. Did you know that when you're bringing the power from the power line outside to your house, so it's all the power that's going to power your whole house, you don't use a 12-gauge wire. Remember, the lower the number, the bigger the wire. You probably don't even use a 8-gauge or a 6. And probably not even a 1-gauge. Instead, you use a 0-gauge. Isn't that funny that you could have a 0-gauge wire? A 0-gauge wire is a great big wire. It's about as big around as your finger. And they call it 0-gauge. But for big houses or for an office, that's still not enough power. With a large house using a lot of power, you need a bigger wire than a 0-gauge. How do you go smaller than 0 to make a bigger wire? No problem. The next size is a double 0-gauge, 0, 0. Only that sounds weird, so electricians call it a double aught. Aught to 0, a double aught wire. The line bringing power into my laboratory is a 4 aught, 4 zeros. It's bigger than my thumb in diameter. So you have to have the right size wire, and you have to protect wires. Have any of you noticed that in your house you have an electric panel with switches? Well, actually, it turns out these are not just switches, they're circuit breakers. They're made to protect wires. And did you know that when you're wiring a house and you're hooking up your power lines, you have to look at the size of the wire and then use a circuit breaker to protect it.